Greetings. Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Very happy to be here. I'm doing a very, very interesting, fun Google Hangout live stream with my current guest, who's a colleague I've known for quite a long time. His name is David Marler. And I want to, just before we get started on our conversation, I've got a nice little bio of David, which incidentally, I'm the publisher of his the book that's given him, I think, the most notoriety, and that is called Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. David is, without a doubt, one of the top experts anywhere you'll find on the phenomenon of triangular UFOs. His book is a classic. It was the moment it was published. He's had a lifelong interest in the subject of UFOs. He's been a member of the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, for many years, since 1990, as a field investigator trainee back in those days. And he's had a number of roles with MUFON in Illinois, and he can tell me if he's involved in the New Mexico MUFON. I actually don't know offhand. But I think the main thing about David, other than the fact that he's been interviewed for quite a few documentaries on the subject of UFOs, he's definitely quite visible, is his personal library. It is really quite extraordinary. There are very few people in the world who have collected, I think, as many newspaper clippings and first direct data on the subject as David Marler. He's a fountain of wealth of information on so many historical cases, seemingly obscure cases, but when you get right down to it, they are absolutely fascinating. So we've done interviews in the past, and it's just been way too long. So David Marler, welcome. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here. Looking forward to a lively discussion.
Well, I think, on your camera there, people can see that you've got a mass of file cabinets behind you. By the way, in your office, that looks like it was designed for J.P. Morgan or some other billionaire. It's like an awesome UFO research room you've got there. But I see those filing cabinets. Can you just tell people about your collection?
We'll do a little angle shot there. I started my active interest in UFOs, as you know, and as you mentioned, back in 1990. And at that time, I started, like most people, we come into the subject, we realize, wow, there actually might be something to this mystery. It's not just a bunch of crackpots and lunatics. And so I started buying books, buying journals, and as many audience members can probably attest as well, and yourself included, you buy one book and you look at the list of references, now you have a hit list of other books you want. And so it just became kind of a snowball effect. And then something, as I started doing lectures and started covering historical cases, a lot of aging UFO researchers in the Midwest and elsewhere started contacting me stating, I'm getting older, or, my husband, my wife, we're getting very ill in our health. We want to make sure that this material is preserved. One, of course, as someone you knew, Lou Farish was one of those. And so Lou entrusted his library to me, along with a lot of other aging researchers. And of course, some of the collections I've purchased as well over the years. And so, as I mentioned to you before we went on air here, the room I'm sitting in is actually a new addition to the home to specifically house this burgeoning library of UFO history.
It's becoming a museum. No kidding.
It is. Well, and in fact, I don't think we've even had a chance to talk about this, but if I could just interject real quick, one of the biggest contributions I think I've done to the field is I've been able to broach a great relationship with the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque. And I've had some recent media coverage, some news segments, Albuquerque Journal, and I've entered into a legal deed of gift. And we eventually, hopefully not anytime soon, when I expire, all of this material will reside at the University of New Mexico, very similar to like Dr. James McDonald's collection at the University of Arizona. And so this material is not going to get dispersed to the four winds when I die. It's going to stay together as a repository of UFO information, UFO history that people will be able to access. And so I am so proud to be able to do that. And also, as a result, they had me as their featured speaker at the University of New Mexico last year to talk on the subject of UFOs. And I think yourself and your audience can agree, if we can get our foot in the door with academia, mainstream academia, to start looking at this subject, that's a huge victory.
Totally agree with you. And I was trying to get a quick count of the number. Those are 4-drawer file cabinets, and I'm guessing you have at least 10 of them there. Is that right?
16.
16.
Yeah, 4-drawer file cabinets. That's just the one side of the room, but I mean, it goes on and on and on. But and then also on the other side here and behind me, I'm not sure how well you or your audience can see, we also have a complete history of UFO books over the last 70 years. Unfortunately, it goes on further
In glass
camera.
cabinets.
So yes, so and the one thing that people are amazed with, and unfortunately it's a testament to my OCD, is how organized it is. And I tell people, if I have this much material and it's not organized, there's no sense having it, because it would take you a fortnight to be able to find one particular case. So before we went on air, I mentioned I actually have some guests arriving this evening. I have Doug Wilson, who's the state director for Colorado MUFON. And some of his investigators are coming down. They're going to spend about 2 to 3 days doing historical research here. So I open it up to credible, serious researchers that want to come and review material, scan it, copy it. The most important thing, I think, is not only to gather the information, but share it with other researchers. I don't have answers to this mystery. I mean, like you, I'm trying to piece together, connect the dots. And if someone can come in from Georgia or, Washington State, come down here, they may find interesting connections, interesting patterns in the data that I've been overlooking all these years. Indeed. So I welcome new insights.
Well, I'm just happy that we have at least one UFO researcher who says fortnight. That's the great win here. So can I ask you, we were going to talk about some interesting cases that are not well discussed. Mm-hmm. Now, you're not just well known for discussing triangular UFOs, and that's always a topic of conversation. It remains fascinating. You've also done a great deal of research on the 1942 so-called Battle of Los Angeles.
Yes.
Probably more than anyone else that's currently researching this. I myself dove into that case a number of years ago. There's a lot there, but you've really, really opened it up. And similarly, the 1950 somewhat forgotten case of the so-called UFO Armada in Farmington, New Mexico.
Yes.
I know you've done a lot of work there. We can touch on these, but honestly, I would like to chat with you about there's a couple of new cases. New, I say in air quotes, because they're not new, but they're new to us. Mm-hmm. And they involve severe injury to individuals directly from UFO activity. And one of them is a historical case from the 60s. In fact, there's a few. I wonder if you can talk about this. You sent me a couple of visuals that we can show people in a little while.
Yes. In going through these records, sometimes we look back on these cases, such as like the Battle of LA, for instance, or Farmington, and we think that these are historical cases. They're relegated to the dustbin. It's history. There's nothing more we can do on it. And to echo a comment that you shared with me, which I've shared with several people, because obviously, Richard, I've always looked to you as the UFO historian. So, I really appreciate you publishing my book and finding value and merit in my work. But one time you came up to me, I think it was after the Farmington incident, and I gave a lecture, and you gave me a compliment, which I'll always remember. You said, Dave, I think you found your niche. You have the ability to take a case that everyone thinks we know everything about, and then you take it one step further and dig deeper and find new insights. I'll never forget when you shared that compliment with me.
I'm glad, because it's really true.
And that's what I've tried to do, because I think we have to look at these UFO cases, these very well documented historical UFO cases, as a criminal case in a sense. They're relegated to the cold case file because we don't think there's not much we can do with them. But sometimes, like with criminal cases, they do dust off the boxes. They do go back into those cold cases. And so I've been trying to do that. In the case of Farmington, for example, I was able to track down the last living witness who's still alive to this day that was mentioned in the Farmington Daily Times from March 18th, 1950. I've met him on several occasions, developed a good friendship with him, have done numerous interviews with him. And it's really interesting. People think a case from 1950, there's nothing more you can do with. Well, I beg to differ. I found new information, new insights. I actually went to the University of Arizona, to the James McDonald collection, and found investigative notes on the Farmington case that gave new insights into that whole episode that transpired over 3 days. And then correlating the newspaper accounts, the government archives, and being able to synthesize. I think that's the key word, synthesize these disparate sources of information. And once you do that, it paints a broader landscape and it paints a clearer picture of what we're dealing with these cases. I would argue the Battle of LA is the same way in that respect. But to your point, there are those obscure cases, the ones that maybe no one has ever heard about, that may have been documented somewhat spotty in the past, but at least it gives us enough. It gives us a location, a date, and a name that maybe we can follow up on.
Before we do those cases, because you really gave a real tease on Farmington, I must say. So could you just give a 5-minute synopsis of that case for people? Because I think there's a lot of folks who do not know this case.
No.
What you have to say about it.
Yes, we have to keep in mind this was 1950, so I mean, just 3 years after the flying saucer wave, still relatively new, even for the Air Force and their investigations. This was during, as I like to call it, Project Grudge, the Dark Ages, as it was often referred to, where it was very anti-UFO as far as the Air Force was concerned at that time. In March, there were 3 days. It was March 16th, 17th, and 18th, 1950. Broad daylight, and I think this is a very important thing we need to point out, broad daylight sightings of anywhere from dozens to hundreds of unidentified objects flying singly and in various formations that were flying over the town of Farmington, New Mexico, up near the Four Corners region, for those that aren't familiar with its location. And it was witnessed by an estimated 2/3 of the townspeople. It was sighted from morning into the noon hours into the late afternoon. What's interesting is when you go to the Air Force Project Blue Book files, I mean, here you think 3 days of broad daylight sightings of dozens to hundreds of objects. Surely there's a Blue Book file. There isn't. You look at the tally sheet, and Farmington is not even mentioned in the March 1950 tally of UFO reports. However, for the tenacious researcher that likes to dig deeper, if you go into their miscellaneous files, you will find 2 OSI spot intelligence reports where Air Force investigators from here in Albuquerque at Kirtland Air Force Base were dispatched to Farmington during the first week or 2 in April to try to interview witnesses. And so we do have official documentation.
So the Air Force went there, but they did not make it an official Blue Book case. How about that?
Correct. And so like many other cases, as we know. And so one of the individuals that was interviewed by the Air Force was the gentleman I referred to earlier. And I can mention his name. It's within the public domain. Mr. Marler Webb is his name.
Okay.
And Marler was interviewed by OSI investigators, as were several of the other townspeople. And we have some of their statements documented over the years, both in newspapers as well as some of the investigative notes by James McDonald. What's interesting, though, I did a presentation, which I think you caught most of, Richard, at a conference a couple years back. My lecture is called Farmington, New Mexico and Beyond, because what we thought was occurring in Farmington was actually transpiring across the state. At the same time, one of the many waves of UFOs during that 3-day period was being sighted over Farmington on the far east side of the state in an area called Tucumcari, New Mexico, documented in the newspapers from the time, and this is going through microfilm at the University of New Mexico. I stumbled across the editor of the newspaper testifying to the fact that many residents of Tucumcari were seeing multiple objects flying in the sky. What's interesting, though, is the detail. Many of the witnesses during the Farmington incident described silver, gray, or white objects with a red leader that was escorting this flotilla.
Interesting.
Mr. Everett, the editor of the Tucumcari newspaper, states the same thing. At the same time that it was being sighted in Farmington, residents in Tucumcari described this fleet of UFOs being escorted by a red leader. And so you have interesting details. And further, the Monday preceding these sightings, I found one little article in Eunice, New Mexico, which is near Hobbs, New Mexico, in the southeast corner of the state. And on that Monday preceding this series of sightings, a couple that were motorists going down the highway saw a glowing red object. And I pose it to my audience, and I pose it to your audience. Could this have been the vanguard of what was to come later that week? Was that same red object that was later escorting these hundreds of objects.
There are very few UFO reports comparatively that are of just straight up red objects. I mean, you get red glowing objects, but it sounds a little bit different.
Right. And the witnesses in the newspaper accounts and even in some of the other accounts, affidavits and so forth, they are very specific. That is one thing that's stuck in the minds of the witnesses. They state matter of factly that there was that one red object that just stood out from all the rest. So it was a very distinctive characteristic that is very hard to imagine that people separately would be inventing on opposite sides of the state at the same time. And we, in fact, in addition to that, we had Air Force personnel at Kirtland Air Force Base on the Friday, the 17th, that described around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I believe it was about 4 or 5 tech sergeants and an Air Force captain standing on the tarmac at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque when all of this was going on, that described 2 mysterious objects tumbling through the air that disappeared over the Sandia Mountains. So we have many, many reports throughout the state, including Las Vegas, New Mexico, and other locations.
I'm so glad we're talking about this because, again, the Farmington case is just one of these cases that there's a little footnote to it in UFO history, and we tend to move on, but there's so much detail here. And as I recall, even though it wasn't a blue book case, the dominant explanation, or at least the popular explanation, was that it was, I think, an exploded balloon of some sort. That's something that, I mean, I recall it, right?
Oh, yeah.
And for 3 days, seriously, that makes no sense. That doesn't have any credibility.
No, you echo statements that I did for local news a couple of years ago when I was interviewed regarding, I was doing a local lecture here and we had some media coverage regarding the incident. And I state matter of factly, and in fact, if later if people go to my website, they can see the news segment. I echo, or you echo exactly what I stated during that news segment. I can understand if it was one day or one afternoon and people observed this, but it was over 3 full days. And that actually was invented, and I use that term very specifically, that explanation was invented by Donald Menzel, who, of course, your audience probably knows is an Archie Bunker. And so he came up with
the Archie Bunker of the 1950s into the 60s.
Yes.
Wrote a number of, he was a Harvard astronomer, so he had a great deal of academic credibility. And we learned years later through the work of Stanton Friedman that Menzel had very, very ultra high level connections with the NSA and the American cryptological community. He had top level clearances that no one, not even his wife, knew about. He was working very, very intimately with what we would now call the intelligence community and deep state.
Yep, absolutely. And it's so funny, though, because that explanation, if you go to Air Force Project Blue Book files, again, there's no official Blue Book explanation, but you will find Air Intelligence files referencing Farmington in these 2 OSI documents where they went out and interviewed witnesses. They have a segment from Menzel's book talking about the Farmington incident. And there are so many errors with this explanation, if you can even use that term. First off, Menzel in his book states that the Farmington incident occurred on one day, March 17th. And tongue-in-cheek, he adds, incidentally, that happened to be St. Patrick's Day, and the subtext was that all the witnesses were drinking and, of course, were hallucinating, which is interesting because, okay, if Menzel's going to state that, then how do you explain the 2 OSI reports which document sightings on the first day, March 16th, not the 17th? So Air Intelligence files completely contradict that statement. And then Menzel goes on to say that this was just a skyhook balloon that was launched at Holloman Air Force Base. Going through Dr. James McDonald's records, he contacted a man in the 60s by the name of Dombrowski, who was with ONR, Office of Naval Research. He went through their records and found no balloon launch at Holloman or anywhere else within a 30-day period around Farmington.
So that rules it out completely.
Yeah, it rules it out completely. And how does that explain sightings across the state at the same time? Those are some amazing balloon fragments.
Oh, just fascinating. Can we switch gears a little bit? And because we have a couple of new cases, and again, new, relatively speaking, they're actually old cases that no one knows about. Now, every now and then in the history of this phenomenon, we come across injury cases where people are physically harmed. There are even a number of alleged cases of death due to interaction with a UFO. And what you have unpack these. These were reported at the time quite a while ago, but you've done some additional research, and I really wonder if you can talk about these.
Absolutely. And I'll just preface my statements by stating I'm only about 3 weeks into this investigation. So this is something very new. This is actually the first time I'm talking publicly about it. So I appreciate the opportunity to have the dialogue with you on this. I was afforded the opportunity to listen to some of the James McDonald audio archives, which are at the University of Arizona. And within just the last 3 or 4 weeks, I was listening to a series of recordings of a woman who was the grandmother of an 8-year-old boy back in 1964, and as well as interviews with the mother and the 8-year-old boy himself. And they, in the interview with Dr. James McDonald, describe in vivid detail this small UFO that came out of the sky, moved directly over this 8-year-old youth, completely bathed him from head to toe in fire, which obviously caused severe injury to him. And so it was interesting because we had the name of the individual, which I started to do an internet search. And after some frustration and after a few hurdles, I was able to find the individual. Now, mind you, he was 8 years old in 64. He was interviewed 4 years later in 68. So he was 12 years old at the time. And I thought, well, it's quite possible, doing the math, that this witness might still be alive.
Yes,
now, the question is, can I track him down? And I'm very happy to say that while I was traveling on business about 3 weeks ago, I was trying to locate him online and happened to be in New Mexico traveling and happened to be in the city where ultimately I found out he still resided. And went to his home, introduced myself, a wonderful gentleman. He confirmed everything that was in the audio recordings and in the subsequent newspaper articles, which I think I've shared with you, Richard. I think you have a few of those. And one thing for any of the UFO history enthusiasts also is it was also the cover story for the Pro Bulletin, which I think we may have an image of that as well.
I have it right here, and allow me to share that with folks right here. Here we go.
There we are.
That's child burned in New Mexico, and this is from 1964, November. This was published by Coral and Jim Lorenzen. They were just superlative leaders of the UFO field, and I just may give a shout out to them as one of the very few married couples that were working this field for such a long time, and built up an amazing UFO organization throughout worldwide, frankly.
Yes.
And they published a bulletin on a pretty much a shoestring budget, an excellent bulletin, which you've got them on. And I have a lot of them. So that's it. And can I show you? There's a couple of other. Oh, do you want to? I've got a couple of newspaper articles.
No, I think let's share those with the audience. I think that gives a great visual backdrop.
So let me scroll ahead here. Whoops, excuse me. I'll be able to do this. Single page. Next, this is the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. Boy burned in mystery mishap, leaves hospital. Yeah, we want to talk about some of the details of this, David. Here's another Lovington Daily leader. Hobbs youth burned by mysterious object. Doesn't necessarily seem that these articles go into the UFO angle, or do they? I actually am wondering.
Well, that's actually a component of the story I was hoping we could talk about, because it's interesting. Some of these articles, when they first were released, they tried to inject a prosaic explanation. One of them states that the boy was at a laundromat, so it's quite possible one of the boilers may have vented steam that created the burns. Yet that flies in the face of what he described and what his grandmother described. Another one, I don't know where they pulled this one out of. It says that he quite possibly was burned by youth across the street or in a neighboring yard that shot off a Roman candle, and the Roman candle came over and burned him. No one described a Roman candle. So, I mean, they were coming up with all of these explanations that didn't fly. And in fact, on some of those newspaper articles, when you read the entirety of some of them, they actually then recant that. They state, well, whereas we thought it was perhaps due to a Boilermaker or due to a Roman candle, those explanations were found not to be proven. And then later, they lean more towards this mysterious object. Now,
can you
go
give
ahead.
a greater detail of the actual incident? Because we have a
Yes,
good overview, but there's quite a bit of detail here.
there is. So let me paint a picture. So this is Hobbs, New Mexico, again, far southeast corner of the state, 1964, June 2nd, to be specific. It's in the afternoon, sunny day, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And this 8-year-old boy is playing in a vacant lot behind the laundromat, which is owned by his grandmother and grandfather. The grandmother is standing at the back door, which is wide open, standing in the doorway of the laundromat. And Charles Davis, that's his name, is out playing in this lot. Now, mind you, he's only about 5 to 6 feet from the grandmother, from the back door. As he's playing, suddenly out of nowhere, this black object, which was described as like a spinning top, it looked like a black spinning top, suddenly comes into view. And immediately Charles sees that. He looks at it and it immediately zeroes in on him. He then, as it's closing at him at a rapid pace, instinctively jumps to the left. The object responds and shifts to the left. He then shifts to the right. The object shifts to the right. Now, mind you, as this is all happening in just a matter of seconds, it's continuing to close on him. So at that point, he instinctively covers his face and ducks his head down. Now, at this point, we have to pick up the narrative from the grandmother's perspective, because admittedly, he can't see anything at that point. The grandmother states that she heard a whizzing sound, and when she looked over, this object, whatever it was hovering directly over her grandson's head, about
Hovering,
a foot.
not moving.
Not moving. And as soon as she looks over, now again, this all happened very fast. As soon as she hears the whizzing sound, she looks over, sees this object hovering above his head about a foot. She says his hair is standing straight up. And then this object belched out flame or something like flame, because there's certain unusual characteristics we can talk about. She said the fire hit his head, his shoulders, showered down, covered his entire body, and then hit the ground and then came back up. At which point the object quickly zipped away. Now, mind you, this happened in just a matter of seconds. The child at this point had suffered burns to his hair, the top of his head, his ears, his face, all the way down around his t-shirt and his neck.
It's incredible. Just incredible.
He immediately and instinctively runs towards his grandmother, because he knew his grandmother was standing inside the doorway right there immediately prior to this incident. As he is running towards her, the grandmother's testimony states, as Charles ran towards me, I could see skin falling off of his face. I mean, we're talking very severe injury.
Yes.
She instinctively, as I think anyone would in that situation, grabbed Charles and tried to console him, at which point his face was, buried into her dress. And shortly after that, the grandfather had pulled up in his vehicle. She immediately told her husband, his grandfather, Charles has been burned. Get him to the hospital. They quickly got him into the vehicle, took him to the local hospital where he was treated for 1st and 2nd degree burns. He was in the hospital for between 9 and 10 days being treated for this. Now, skin was immediately falling off the face at that point. And in the ensuing minutes from where he was burned to when he went to the hospital, which was just nearby, by the time he got to the hospital, his mother stated that his face had swelled up so much that his eyes looked like they were sunken in, and she said he looked like some kind of monster.
My God.
In the ensuing days, his skin turned black and began flaking off. Now, what's interesting about this is local police were involved in the investigation. Local media, as you shared with the audience, covered it in the newspapers. Something in the newspaper accounts that I was later able to get additional information on, the local police took samples of the dress that the grandmother was wearing, the clothes that Charles was wearing, and they also contacted the FBI. The FBI dispatched field investigators, special investigators, to go on scene and interview the boy in the hospital and the grandmother. And in the interviews that I heard, the grandmother years later was always frustrated with the fact that the FBI took my dress and they never returned it, which I thought was rather funny. They never returned Charles's clothes that he was wearing. They never returned the dress that the grandmother was wearing. They also took skin and hair samples from the boy. And they never heard anything more regarding the case. As we were alluding to, though, Charles was in the hospital for 9 to 10 days, and after that was released. But other than the Lorenzens investigating the case and documenting it in the Pro Bulletin that we just looked at, there really hasn't been any follow-up or subsequent investigation, which is
amazing. May I ask you, was there a medical conclusion as to, I mean, obviously he had burns, but was there anything else that was determined to have happened to this young man, Charles? Radiation or any other kind of toxicity or any other type of medical damage that had occurred to him?
Apparently not. And as I alluded to earlier, Richard, in reference to your question, it looks like he was burned by fire, but yet there was unusual characteristics. For example, and some of this could maybe be attributed to shock as well, certainly, but initially upon being burned, he stated that he didn't feel any pain. Now, again, that could be shock, that could be adrenaline. Later, when he was in the hospital, I believe he was administered medication to help remedy the pain.
But the thing is, like, when your face turns black or part of your skin's falling off, that strikes me as agonizing. I mean, excruciating pain.
I would think so.
Right?
I would certainly think so.
But it doesn't seem like that actually happened to that degree. Obviously, it was painful for him, but I didn't get the idea that this was, I mean, the kinds of injuries that he's experiencing were really life-threatening and deeply traumatizing.
Indeed. And I don't know if I had mentioned it before we went on or if we had just mentioned it earlier, but I did track this gentleman down. He's still alive. And so I've had the opportunity in the last 2.5 weeks to actually meet with him and do a preliminary interview. And he stated, and I asked the same question you did, what type of health issues did you have immediately after and then subsequent in later years? He stated that once his skin healed, that he was fine. He had no more ill effects, which is really amazing. No signs of what we would consider radiation poisoning or radiation sickness. The only hair loss was obviously what was initially burned from when the fire hit him, but his hair grew back. There were some long-term residual effects. He needed to wear glasses after the event. He did not need glasses.
Oh, really? Interesting.
And he had, I believe it was either the left or the right ear, he had some hearing damage for an extended period of time, which I believe later remedied itself. But the glasses were definitely required after, but not before the incident.
Very interesting, because there's, like, for people who are medical experts, biological experts, I would think that there's a certain amount of information in here that they could work with to sleuth out, like, what could have caused the types of injury and symptoms and repercussions that he had. I can't, I'm not, and you'd want a burn expert as well to look into these. And there's a lot going on with this case, aside from the fact that what was this thing that seemed to zero in on this 8-year-old boy? Why is an obvious question as well. How? I mean, how? What was this thing? It didn't come out of the laundromat. Clearly, that wasn't a Roman candle. How ridiculous!
Right.
I mean, you could conceivably think, I can understand investigators wanting to go down those explanations, because what else could they think of? You want to come up with something that makes sense, but what else would make sense? Frankly, it's very bizarre. Well,
in the nature of the UFO description, we're not describing a 30-foot flying saucer, which, back in the early 60s, those reports were fairly common. I find it interesting that they report something that is, at least to the general public's knowledge at the time, something far askew from your traditional flying saucer. This black top, this black flying top, was described as being somewhere between like 4 foot by 5 foot in size. So a relatively small UFO. You know, do you want to call that a drone? I don't know, but you know, certainly not a drone we had in '62 that could perform like that. And what would be the purpose of that? It was speculated at the time. Charles had told me that he and his family thought, well, maybe it was something from White Sands, but you know, now decades later, looking back on it, he laughs at that notion. He said, well, I don't think we had anything like that in 1962. And I said, well, White Sands is, even though it's in New Mexico, it's a pretty far distance. I said, if that thing went
Yeah.
off course, it really went off course. And
No, absolutely.
what's interesting is the Blue Book tally, again, looking at the Blue Book tally for '64, this isn't referenced. It's a footnote at the bottom, and it references newspaper article or newspaper source only. But ironically enough, Air Force investigators were never dispatched to investigate this case. Now, here you have physical evidence, potentially, of a UFO interacting with an individual.
Right.
And yet Air Force investigators weren't interested in that. They'd rather go chase lights in the sky reports.
What a lot of people forget, again, with the passage of time, we tend to forget everything. But by the early 1960s, Project Blue Book really was, honestly, it was the butt of jokes across the nation. You know this very well through the newspaper clippings. It was a given that, you know, if there were 500 UFO cases, there would be 1,000 explanations from the Blue Book team just to explain these things away. And I think very few people were taking Project Blue Book seriously at that time. And the reason is very obvious, because they had basically no staff to work with, and they did very few on-site investigations. There were a few, of course, that they did, but nothing that was really scientific. When you mentioned James McDonald several times, and of course McDonald more than anyone else, but also Alan Hynek pointed out that Blue Book was not and was never a scientific organization, never operated on principles of scientific investigation, and was really more politicized for debunking than anything else. They were not serious in their investigations or analysis. But yet, even to this day, people talk about the Blue Book unknowns, as if those are these amazing cases. And a lot of the Blue Book unknowns, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but are some of the most boring unknowns imaginable. I've often suspected this is why they let them be unknowns. You know, some light in the distance moves up and over and then is gone. It's like, who cares? That's their unknown, nothing to get excited about. Whereas the fascinating cases like this case from 1964, they didn't even investigate.
Well, and to your point, Richard, I think part of that was by intent, even if they could, because this was relatively close. They didn't have to dispatch investigators across the country for this one. They had OSI investigators right there at Kirtland. But in dispatching investigators from the Air Force, from Kirtland Air Force Base down to Hobbs, you're adding fuel to that media frenzy that already existed. And so you're almost indirectly endorsing it by taking the time to go down there and investigate it. So they may have turned a blind eye intentionally, not to give any more fuel to the media fire that was taking place.
Absolutely. And then also by investigating it, maybe some people will think you have to come up with an answer at a certain point. And what kind of answer would they want? You know, it's just much easier to let it go, which is what they were really trying to do by then anyway. It's interesting, 1964, in my estimation, begins an uptick in UFO cases in the United States that really went up high in 1965 and then higher again in '66. But '64, I would say, was part of that crescendo, and they were completely unable to handle this uptick of sightings.
And Richard, just to touch on what you mentioned earlier, I think we need to provide some historical context. You were just referencing that very rarely did they dispatch investigators or Hynek to actual cases because of limited funds, limited budget. But of course, 1964, April, just months prior to this incident, we had, of course, the famous Socorro, New Mexico case, which was really a turning point for Hynek in many respects. And so there was a lot going on in New Mexico in 1964. In fact, I found some other cases that I've stumbled across in looking at this case.
Yeah,
And
I think I'd love to hear about it. Is there anything else we need to say about this particular case from Hobbs, New Mexico?
The only thing I would mention is the fact that I will be meeting with this individual again very soon, doing a more formal interview. I'm hoping maybe at some point I can share segments of that interview. But it's a very early investigation at this point. But
And you mentioned you've listened. Did you visit the James
yeah,
McDonald
yes,
archive?
a few years back, I went to the James
Right.
McDonald archives at the University of Arizona. And for anyone that ever finds themselves going to Phoenix or Tucson area, I highly recommend you go to Tucson and take a look at the James McDonald archives. There's a treasure trove of material there.
I
But
didn't want to give up any information that you were
no.
wanted to be careful about, but you did. And he had some information on this case.
Yes, yeah, they have his audio files recorded, his audio interviews. So I've been able to listen to the interviews with the grandmother, the aunt, as well as Charles, who was 12 years old at the time. And that was what kind of tipped me off to this case. But then I later wanted to try to see if I could find out any more information, and so stumbled across the witness. And a lot of these cases involving children, especially children or adolescents, back in the 60s and 70s. It's quite possible we can still track these individuals down. And I think it's interesting. It's one thing to read the testimony from the time, but now with the passage of quite literally decades, see if they still stick to their story. See if their
Absolutely.
testimony still matches what they described back then. And,
Sure.
and especially this individual, he is not seeking, nor did he ever seek publicity. In fact, he told me the media coverage, some of which we shared with the audience today, in the newspapers, that was completely unsolicited on their part. The media descended upon them. They weren't, I mean, obviously, the last thing that he could care about is the local newspaper reporter showing up to try to take pictures of him disfigured by this object that severely burned him. But something we referenced before we went on air, Richard, is I received lots of submissions and requests for information. And I had a gentleman recently in New York asked me about a Cherry Creek, New York case from 1964. And this was just 2 weeks after I had interviewed this gentleman, Charles, regarding the burn case. And in going through some of my original Blue Book material, I stumbled across a reference to a case from Livonia, Georgia in 1964, the same month that Charles was burned. And they described a similar object emitting heat, flying in very much the same way with a very similar description. And I'm looking here, Charles's case occurred on June 2nd, and the case in question occurred on June 28th, that same month, describing a similar object shaped like a spinning top, black, belching flame. And the motorist described his arm being burned as a result of close proximity to this UFO. Now,
Georgia,
again,
quite a long way from New Mexico. From New Mexico, it's very long.
From New Mexico, but 2 days later, there's another case from Georgia. A motorist driving right near the South Carolina border describes a spinning top emitting heat that he observed. And in fact, I have some other ones that I just came across in the last few days that I'm still diving into. Apparently, along the Georgia-South Carolina border, towards the end of June, beginning of July, there were at least 4 to 5 or 6 different incidents describing this small, relatively small UFO shaped like a top with fire coming out of the bottom, emitting heat. And at least in this other case, burning a witness in his arm.
Now, I wonder,
isn't that interesting?
Well, this is fascinating. And I wonder if these are contained to that period of time, the mid 1960s. I mean, this is asking a lot of you, but if you are aware, if anyone's aware, that these continued into more recent decades.
Yeah.
I mean, one hears about the Brazilian case, Colares, Brazil. Bob Pratt wrote about this UFO. Did he write Danger Zone?
Danger Zone.
Tony Loggins song. Yeah,
Yep.
UFO Danger Zone. But he wrote quite a bit about about similar burn injury cases there. And those were later. Those were not, I think those were from the 70s. But what do you have a theory about what was happening here, David?
I don't. But what's interesting, and I think we have to take a step back and acknowledge this, these objects are belching out flame. In fact, the grandmother, I failed to mention this earlier, the grandmother kept referencing burners, that she was very specific. She said there were 3 burners on the bottom of this object.
Oh, okay.
And that was the term she kept using, like an oven or a stove. She said there were 3 burners that were jettisoning this type of fire, this heat. And when you look at that, and when you look at the descriptions of these other witnesses, this seems like a very clunky type of UFO. It's not some type of sleek flying saucer with some type of field propulsion technology. It almost sounds archaic in some respects. It's belching flames and moving around and darting about. It seems like a very unusual UFO.
Except for the fact that they seemed highly maneuverable and intelligently guided, and I would even say malicious in intent. So they had certain capabilities that even for the 1960s, yeah, they're burning, belching red flames. So that seems totally within human capabilities, but still very advanced, it would seem.
Well, and Richard, one little characteristic, and I'm sure you appreciate this as a historical researcher, when you find these little details like this, as I mentioned earlier, when the UFO was approaching Charles, he stated that instinctively he kind of jumped to the left and it jumped to the left. He went to the right, it jumped to the right. One of the witnesses in Georgia, just 2 or 3 weeks later, described this flying, spinning top, belching fire as moving like a hummingbird. And isn't that interesting? Because isn't that kind of an interesting descriptive of how hummingbirds make those acute, sharp turns and angular
lateral movements? Yeah, like that hummingbird uniquely can do.
But when you find details like that, seemingly from disparate witnesses within a fairly confined time period, I find it very interesting. And again, not the ubiquitous flying saucer. This is this clunky black spinning top, about 4 to 5 feet in size. It's very unusual, almost similar to what I was referencing with the red leader from Farmington. Very specific, kind of archaic type of description for someone to be throwing out there. Yet we have witnesses describing the same thing.
It just shows how this phenomenon doesn't easily fit within one single narrow confine. Tracy's in the other room listening to comments, and if she has anything, she can bring them into this room, and people can ask you some questions directly, because we've got about 10 minutes or so, frankly.
Oh my goodness.
We've gone through this time. It's just amazing, honestly, David. Well, it's all of those file cabinets behind you, and you've just got a huge amount of data to work off of, and you're dedicated.
Yeah, and I like I said, I have a lot of researchers come. I'll have some researchers arriving this evening. They'll be here for the next 2 to 3 days, and while they're here going through the files, I'm going to be doing further work on this case that we're talking about, and on similar cases. I'm going to be doing a database search, trying to find other burn cases, not just around 1964, June 64, but like you said, let's extrapolate that and see, do we have this across the 1960s? Do we have any cases that predate this from the 1950s? But I've always said, and I just recently had a conversation with Jan Harzan at MUFON, quite often critics within the UFO field itself will often say, well, why do we need to continue to go out and get more UFO reports? Do we really need another report of a light in the sky? And I would agree with that to some extent. I think we still need to investigate new cases. But the one thing that I would really petition your audience members and researchers out there, and some of whom are already doing this, we need to start parsing the data. I mean, this is just what I have here, but when you really think about it, collectively, we have 70 plus years of UFO case files.
Right.
Air Force files, civilian files, newspapers. And we need to start drilling down and looking at the data we already have. And one of the examples, which was actually an inspiration for my book, was the work by Dr. Mark Rodiger, his vehicle interference catalog, where he looked for patterns in the data, and he assembled that fantastic catalog of vehicle interference cases. I think we all need to start looking at the data in a deeper way and look for patterns in the data, because as I've always argued, if we're truly dealing with something of intelligent design that's not ours, there must be a pattern. There must be a pattern to the data. There may be a pattern to the characteristics being reported.
As you were speaking, I was looking around for my copy. I have it in this room here of the NICAP, the old 1964 NICAP UFO evidence collection.
UFO evidence.
Which is, if anyone has heard about this and they don't have it, it's absolutely worth having. Tracy's hunting around for. Don't worry about it. No, it's a big book. I just meant because this is a collection very similar to what you're kind of talking about. They put this together way back in the early 60s. Of different types of UFO reports, and I will bet anything that within that collection they had a number of these spinning top-like UFOs. I would bet anything that they're in there.
Yep.
Tracy's here with me. She's got a couple of questions. Can I just run a couple by you? We've got 5 minutes, David.
Oh my goodness!
We're done with this, and I just want people to know you and I will continue we'll do another interview. That will be on the Richard Dolan members site, and we're going to talk about. I think we want to talk about the Battle of LA with you, and maybe a couple of other things. Here's a question. Let's see here. Did they check for any residue on soil? I wonder if they even checked for radioactivity, napalm type substance, plasma is one question. And then one other person asked, can you describe the size and description of the object? I know that you did that, but if you can just repeat that, David.
Sure. Well, let me address the first question, which is a really good one. With regard to residue, the testimony of the grandmother and the mother, they stated that the local police arrived on the scene. They were the first, obviously, there, and then they reached out to the FBI. They again, based on the testimony we have in the James McDonald archives, they checked the soil, and by the way, there was there was no vegetation. It was just dirt back there, so there's no vegetation that could have been burned.
Okay.
There was dirt, but there was no evidence, they stated, of any residue. There was no scorch marks or anything of that nature. So just to address that question. Now, certainly napalm. The only residue that was found on Charles, which is mentioned in one of the newspaper articles, is he had black soot. Now, that could have been from his hair burning and falling down on his shoulders and on his T-shirt, but there was no chemical or any type of residue other than the soot that was found.
Napalm would be very, very almost deadly, it would seem to me.
Yeah, I think he'd be having a lot of residual health effects as a result of that.
Did any skeptics promote the theory of ball lightning? That was another question that someone had asked.
Well, no, that's a valid point. What's interesting is, again, and I think it speaks to the obscure nature of this report, the skeptics never weighed in on it. I found no skeptics at the time because, to be honest with you, the UFO community didn't weigh in very heavily. To be honest, the most in-depth investigation, which essentially equated to one article, was Jim and Cora Lorenzen from APRO investigating it. And then later James McDonald, who, of course, looked back on a lot of older cases. He spoke with the witnesses 4 years after the incident in 1968. Yeah,
McDonald was very, very engaged in a lot of these cases, and this one was not an old one by the time he got to it.
No.
And actually, how would you think ball lightning, frankly, because there's just very clear witness descriptions of the object. It's clearly not a plasma type of object seen by the boy or his grandmother, to say nothing of the cases in Georgia. So
yeah,
that doesn't make sense to me.
It's somewhat rare in the sense that it's not a point of light. It's not a light that's being described. It's not a reflective silvery object like a flying saucer. It was a black top, which is interesting because that's what was described in some of these other cases in Georgia.
A top shape, and roughly again the size?
Approximately 4 feet by 5 feet. So, and I'm still trying to gauge what was the length, what was the width. But again, it's very early.
Large. That's fairly large, though. It's not enough to climb into it and fly off like a flying saucer.
Exactly.
It's not tiny.
Yes. So it's unusual though for that time. That's a very unusual description.
Well, David, we're running out of time for this segment of our chat. I knew this would be great, and you clearly came through. It was fascinating. This is the thing that people really need to know about you, about David Marler, is this is the kind of researcher that you are. Very serious. What makes you I think, is your willingness to go into these very, very strange cases, but you do so very meticulously, very scientifically, with integrity toward the data itself. And you never overstate things. You never make wild claims. You're always driven by evidence. And I know for sure this is what all of us appreciate about the work you do. And here you come again. You pull up another case from the past that everyone's forgotten about, or frankly, not even forgotten about. No one really knew about.
No, it's very obscure.
Yeah. So I think it's just fascinating.
Well, thank you.
If people want to know more about you, I know you have your own website that is, now, well, I have you linked at richarddolanpress.com.
Sure.
Your bio is there. Your book, Estimate of the Situation, Triangular UFOs, is linked there. But your website is, it's David Marler Triangular UFO, please.
DavidMarlerUFO.com.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I didn't know it offhand.
No.
Now we know. David Marler UFO. You can always Google David Marler. You'll get all the stuff that he's up to. And David, do you have anything else interesting going on in the near future?
No, just some local lectures here in the greater Albuquerque, New Mexico area, and looking forward to just doing some more further research into this. Like I said, this is early discussion of some new early research on. It's a whole new avenue I'm taking.
Fascinating.
But, still looking to dig deeper.
People really need to know more and more about the work you do. You're really one of the treasures we have. So that's all the time we have for this segment, David. I want to thank everyone for listening. If you want to hear more about what David and I will do, please go to Richard Dolan Members, where David and I are going to discuss the Battle of Los Angeles and probably a few other things, maybe even some research-related things. Who the heck knows? We're just going to let it roll. But for now, that's all we've got. So thank you, everyone. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later. Thank you, David.
Thank you.